Howdy, partners. Hope you all recovered from the exam on Tuesday. Before we start today's class, as I mentioned to you, we have a special visitor. Chancellor Wilcox is with us today, and he'd like to chat with you folks for a little while. So thanks for coming, and I hope you enjoy this. Let me turn it over to Chancellor Wilcox.
I didn't know this was a costume party. I'd have brought a hat.
Oh, always a costume party.
So do we call you Tex or?
Sure, Tex Rosenblum.
Well, thanks everybody for the letting me pop in like this. I appreciate it. Thanks Larry for the time. I don't have an agenda at all. Just wanted to stop in and do a few things. One, thank everybody. This has been a trying time for everybody at UCR, and I know I'm looking at the screen full of names here. Some of you are sitting on your beds in your bedrooms with your younger brother and sister in the next room trying to get through high school, and it's a challenge for everybody, and I know everybody's working to make this work, so thanks. And then the other thing, I just wanted to see how things were going. Basically, from where I sit, the university has done amazingly well. Some of you have heard me talk before about universities not being campuses but being comprised of people, and I think this is a great example of that. We're not, most of us aren't on the campus, but the university continues on, not in the way we'd want, but in the best that we can manage. And so this is a kind of reminder of what a university is and what it can do. But mostly I just wanted to hear how things are going for people. Professor Rosenblum, anybody in the class, kind of thoughts as we're halfway through the quarter, and thoughts about how we move ahead, or questions, any questions, of course. There's 1,000 questions and I've got about 4 answers, but I'll try to distribute them across the 1,000 questions. So, floor is open.
Let's see.
The chat's starting to light up.
Yeah, the chat's lighting up. Can you see the chat, or should I read it to you?
I just opened it. Online classes be permanent, will fall be online. Two questions. I probably get more than any other ones. And everybody's been reading the papers about other universities and opening of classes and all the rest. Most of and I've been on, just yesterday I was on a meeting with the 10 chancellors from the rest of the UC, and the day before that I was in 2 different meetings with national groups of presidents and chancellors. Most everybody believes, most everyone wants to try to get back to campus by the fall, wherever they are in the country. But most of them believe that will be a challenge, and I would say over half think it's unlikely. We right now at Riverside have several groups meeting, one that's looking just at classes, one that's looking at research activities, one that's looking at residence halls, trying to look at the different options. In case you didn't know, right now the Riverside County has the most stringent public health order in the state. We're actually the only UC that has been ordered to close by our public county health officer. The others have been working under the governor's restrictions, which are strict, but not as strict as ours. So a lot of what happens in the fall will depend on what our local county health does, as well as what the state does. The big, I'm going on, I know, but I'll try to be quick. The big question is testing. So there are lots of conversations, both political conversations and scientific conversations, about how or if we could test the population in a way that would assure safety. So who all would have to be tested? How often would you test people to identify where an outbreak might be and then contain it should it happen? That's very much a question left to science at this point. UCSD is probably ahead of the rest of the country. They're actually running a pilot right now. They have about 5,000 students on the campus for this quarter, and they're running a pilot to help inform the whole country. So I don't know. If I were going to bet, I would bet most of our classes will be remote in the fall, but I hope I'm wrong. When we're registered for classes, I'm not sure. I better not give you the date. Some of the dates have changed, and I wouldn't want to confuse you. I'd go to the registrar's website or for that. Allowed on campus training pictures. I would say yes. I'm thinking of the campus, and I actually, I live right by campus. I live on campus actually, and I oftentimes take my bike around campus late in the day when I'm done here, just to kind of touch base. The campus is empty, but there are people walking their dogs and the rest. So I think of it as a park. You can certainly go and have your picture taken by the UC. Of course, social distancing, masks in public, you can take it off the photo. Yeah, the answer to that is yes. Have been hard for me so far. Yeah, is it good for you? GPA is up. Yeah, the organization, almost everybody says it's hard to stay organized. And it's, no offense, Professor Rosenblum, despite the costume, it's sometimes hard to stay connected, to stay engaged. I mean, it's easy to wander off and start, surfing the net or, talking to somebody in the room or something. It's easy to it's harder to stay engaged in the class, no doubt, than this. So I've heard that a lot. Capacity change per class, hopefully, yes. Yeah, I'm hopeful that whether the campus opens or not, we're going to run the same kinds of procedures for class changes and the rest. And certainly if we have to have changing back forth between remote and not, we're going to have to leave lots of spaces. Plans for graduating seniors. I'm trying to go through the list here. Yes, there was a working group, I think is what we called it, that included several graduating seniors as part of the discussion. Their recommendation was we should not do commencement remotely. The feeling was that simply wasn't sufficient. So what their recommendation was is we postpone commencement to some time when we can reassemble on the campus. That could be the fall, it could be, who knows, next spring in worst case scenario. So that decision has been made. We're not sure when that will be. We're nonetheless planning some celebrations, we're calling them, for this spring. The deans right now, in fact, yesterday, I think the deans reviewed a plan that would have kind of like a half-hour remote celebration. I'll make some comments. So I think the president of the seniors class will make, there'll be a few little speeches, and then other groups, whether it's a department or a college, could add other virtual things around that, just as a way of marking this point in time. So a little bit of celebration and hopefully a commencement of some type later on. When will we know about remote? Another very good question. And this is the real tension for me. I don't want to make a decision too soon that we have to be remote and then find out we don't have to be. But I want to make it as soon as possible so all of you and all the faculty and everybody else can start to plan. The good news is most of the UC is on quarters, except for Berkeley and Merced, but most of the rest of the country is on semesters. So when you read about universities making announcements, they're actually making announcements for the middle of August or late August when their classes start. We have a little more time. I'm not saying I want to put this off, but hopefully we'll know more here by next month. Our stay closed order in Riverside County ends June 18th. We're right now starting conversations among the 10 UCs to start to ramp up research activity as a first way of kind of engaging the campus, and that can happen over the summer, and we'll learn a lot from that experience. I think we have to have some kind of decision by June, but I really don't know right now.
So is that what's meant by a hybrid model for the fall? That it would...
Different people have used the term hybrid different ways. One of them is just this: if we ramped up research, then we probably would ramp up graduate study with that to some degree. And for people who are undergrads here, for most of us as undergrads, we go to classes in different areas. So we go to classes in math and English, and we run into lots of different people. And if you think of this as an epidemiologist, that's the best way to spread a disease. Yeah. In graduate school, you tend to stay with the same group of people. Right. And so it's easier to manage the spread of the disease, not just manage it, but understand it and monitor. If we were testing to know where those spots are and how to manage them. So that would be, and it would also tell us a lot about our bigger opportunity to add more people to the campus. So that's one way people talk about hybrid. The other way to talk about hybrid is a mix of online or remote and in class. Some campuses, some universities in the country are actually talking about you could enroll in a class in the fall and you could choose face-to-face or online. I don't think that's going to be very viable, because that means poor Professor Rosenblum has to do 2 classes. and then all of you have to decide which one you want to be in, and are they the same thing, and which one's easier, which one's harder, which one's going to, I think that's making more work, not less. But hybrid's been used both ways. Oh, sorry, I'm on grade curve, that's a professor question. We've tried, and that's the faculty senate, have really deferred most of those decisions to the faculty. And that's in large measure because of the differences in classes. As you know, there are some classes that are very small, that are all about writing. There are some classes that are very large, that are all about multiple choice tests. And so to make one decision about all tests on testing scales would be pretty hard to do. Trajectory of wise taking it as of now. Yeah, the next question is trajectory. I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't study infectious diseases, but I read a lot and I talk to a lot of experts. Most everybody I talk to says there will be a second wave. The questions are, when will it happen? How big will it be? Some now are predicting it'll be bigger than the first wave in terms of numbers of people. And the third is, are we prepared to manage it? We weren't prepared to manage the first wave. That really was a lot of the crisis. We didn't have the hospital beds, the ventilators, the emergency room capacity, the knowledge. We're better off now. We're not all the way there. And then the fourth piece of that is knowledge about the disease. And that's testing. There's different kinds of testing. We go through all that. Contact tracing, actually keeping track of who had the disease and who they talked to, who they breathed on. Those last 2 pieces we're better at now than we were before, but we still have a long way to go. But the disease itself will likely take another jump, particularly as so many states loosen up around the country. We have the option, even if online classes aren't mandatory, will we have the option to take them? That again is a faculty senate decision. In general, the answer is yes, but as you know, there are limits, excuse me, on how many you can take to count toward degrees and major and all those. Those are limits that are set by the faculty senate. The Senate to date, since March at least, has been very flexible in trying to make amendments and changes to those. So I would believe the answer is going to be yes. Well, campus is truly open. Ada is thinking like I'm thinking. I think the campuses that are talking, okay, I'm gonna be honest with you. I talk with a lot of presidents around the country. Many of them are talking about opening in the fall publicly. If you ask them privately, they will tell you, well, that's really just aspirational. That's really what we're hoping for. I'll be honest with you, I think it's deceptive. What they're trying to do is encourage students to enroll in their universities, and I think it's unfortunate, and I've told them that. And the ones that do, there are some that I think are going to do it. I'm guessing as likely as not they're going to have to reclose again. So, but that's just one guy's opinion. I'm looking down here to see if you're recording it. It doesn't look like it. So, fees. Thank you. Let me do a little bit of a short course on fees, because there's been a lot of questions about fees. Tuition and the kind of the standard university fee, we have collected. It's not my decision, but the president of the board, the chancellors, we've collected that, and we'll keep it because we got to keep operating the university in a way. We have 280 class fees, like chemistry lab has a fee in every class. We've canceled every one of those except for 8. So 8 out of 280 of those will be collected this quarter. We have either eliminated or postponed most other fees, late fees for enrollment, late fees for library books. All those have been extended or eliminated. There's a group of fees that are left, and rec center fee that you mentioned here, Eugene, is one of those, and probably the best example, because number one, it's the largest, and number two, the rec center's closed. There's a group of fees like that, though I don't have the list in front of me, that are more difficult, and I hope to have a response and a plan out to all of you here this week or next. We've been going through those. So if you take the rec center fee, part of the fee is to pay the mortgage on the buildings, and we have to, that money's already been spent, so we have to collect that. So I can't refund it because it's already been spent on the mortgages. Part of the money is for operating the facility and providing services, paying the staff and all that goes with it. We have kept some activities going. I refer to yoga class on campus. We're doing some of that from the rec center, but most of the rec center services aren't being offered. We're trying to separate those fees out so we can return the piece that we're not using. Now, at the same time, there's a lot of employees, student employees included, who are paid from that fee. We've promised to continue to pay them all through the quarter, even though we're going to refund this portion of the fee. And hopefully I'll get that information out to you soon. We've got lots of lawyers and accountants working on that. I realize I just ate 20 minutes of your class, Professor.
Okay, they're important questions. I also encourage you to look at Chancellor Wilcox's video blogs that he's been doing. They've been very, very useful. They clear up a lot of information. And I just want to say one more thing about, from the perspective of a professor here, that we know online is not optimal. We know that students much prefer to come to class. That being said, I think we're getting a little better as time has gone on. And I would imagine by the fall, we're going to have this down better than we do right now, the professors. I mean, there's a lot of, not only are we practicing on our own as we're teaching, but there's a lot of discussion amongst the professors on how to best do this. Not just, how to teach the lectures like this, but how to involve students in the research that still is going on campus. Because there is some it's not necessarily on campus, of course, but it's being done online. So a lot of our psychology research is being done online, and we can involve undergraduate psychology majors online with that research. So we're trying to figure out all this stuff, and I promise everybody that by the fall, if we are online again, we will be much better at this, and it will be a much more engaging university atmosphere online by then.
I agree entirely, Larry. For those of us who are professors, in the sane world, a year ago, if one of us were going to put a course online, we would spend probably a year working on it. We'd work on new materials, new ways to display the material online. We'd think about the assessment process. We'd consult with educational experts on how to organize the material. We'd rethink everything. And none of us had that chance. We just had to find a way to get it onto the web. And I agree, we're learning a lot, and people now have the time to kind of settle in. And all of you are helping us. Your feedback is crucial to that. So thanks.
Yeah, we truly are doing this all together.
There was a question here popped up, library books. I don't know. I'm going to have to write that one down. That's the first person to ask me how to get a library book returned. I would imagine the drop box is open, but I don't know. So I'll try to get that figured out, and I'll send it to Professor Rosenblum. How's that?
Sounds good.
All right, I don't need to keep you guys, but thanks. And thanks to everybody. Thanks. This is the best of UCR. I'm looking at all the names on the screen. So thanks so much, guys. Bye-bye. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye. A couple of things that I'd like to continue from the discussion with the Chancellor, and that is, yes, about the curve. We are very aware of what you folks are going through, and we know that you are struggling with so many things, things that are going on at home, trying to stay up with your courses and that sort of thing. So I certainly am going to be providing a generous curve, and I think most of the faculty I've talked to are too. We assume that as you folks become a little bit more comfortable in this situation, that, we can ask a little bit more of you, but right now, yes. And so, with regard to this first exam, you did well, but we'll make sure that we consider the circumstances when it comes to actually assigning a letter grade. So let me stop there and let me stop being a cowboy and see if you guys have any questions on your first exam. Hopefully you didn't find it too bad and you didn't find it too surprising. But questions on the first exam. It looks like everybody finished it by midnight on Tuesday, so that was good. Got questions? I'm hoping you guys, yeah. You can still hear me okay, right? You're still hearing me? Yes, okay, good, 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 good. Thank you for that. Any questions on the first exam? Are we able to, yes, okay, John asked, are we able to see our wrong answers? Yeah, I think that the way this works, I think the way iLearn works is that you in fact get to see your full exam with your answers and the correct answers, and that's wonderful for you because that's really going to help you study for the next exam, which is great. It will kind of help you sort out the questions. And also, I recommend that if you're not happy with how you did, you thought you would have done much better, that you absolutely talk to your TA. That's what they are there for. They are there for you to go over your exam and help you do better on the next exam if you're not happy with how you did. I will be posting the scores along with a very, very rough grade range on Friday. And that rough grade range, as I mentioned before, what that's going to do is it's going to give you a general sense of whether your performance on the first exam kind of falls within the A range, B range, C range. And that's rough because no grades are being assigned. We're going to wait till the very end and add up all your points across all the exams and then look to see how the rest of the class did. And then we'll be assigning grades, including pluses and minuses and all that stuff. The letter grade that you're going to see associated with your exam is a very rough idea of how you're doing relative to the rest of the class. Oh, the grades are on iLearn already? Oh my gosh. Oh gosh. I did everything I could so you wouldn't see them, but it's okay. There's a small chance that those grade numbers might change if we have to throw out a question or two. You know what I did? I went through and I checked off everything, so you couldn't see it on the grade reports, and you couldn't see it when you finished your exam and stuff. I did everything I could to make sure that, it didn't freak people out to see their number. I guess I didn't do well enough. Again, take that with a grain of salt. The number might change depending on whether or not we have to throw out a question or two, and the letter grades obviously haven't been assigned. Again, what we're going to be doing is taking your score from this exam, your score from the final exam, adding them up, seeing how the rest of the class is done, and then assigning a letter grade only at that time. All right. I don't know how to see what I got wrong. Again, I'm sorry, I don't want you to see anything right now. So there is nothing, right now, I would prefer that you couldn't see anything about the exam at all. On Friday, I'm going to provide, give whatever information iLearn gives to you about the exam. I just wanted to make sure, I want to go through the questions to make sure we don't have to pull any out. So I'm sorry you can't see more detail than you want to see right now, but if it were up to me, you wouldn't see anything at all. So. Will the final be cumulative? No, it's just on the second half of the course, everything that we're learning from today on, plus last week's sections, but that's probably something most of you knew. Anything else about the exam? You'll probably have more questions. Average, I don't remember it offhand. I'll give that to you next time. Anything else about the exam? Okay. So then let's go ahead and start talking about the new material. And yeah, we did have a kind of eat up a lot of the class today, but that's okay. We'll take it a little easy today. You guys just had your exam. What we're going to start talking about is touch perception. And the way I want to get into touch perception is kind of an interesting story. It involves an individual who lost their sight when they were, I think, he was into his early 20s. And it's a really interesting story. He decided to kind of deal with that psychologically, emotionally, by trying to force himself to do something that other people would think was impossible. And that is learn to paint. His name's John Bramblett, and the way I'll introduce you to him is through a little video. I realize the videos don't go well on Zoom, so I'm not going to show you the entire video. I will post it. I'll post a link so you can see it later on. But let's go ahead and watch part of it just to give you a sense of who he is, and then I'll talk about some of the details. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And there he is. And let me move this. There's John right there. Let me show you part of the video. Hopefully it will be okay. And then we'll come back and talk about some of the details.
I was cycling very slowly at first. I didn't even realize it when I first noticed I was having trouble with my sight. I was already twice over the legal limit for being blind. There were just less and less things I could do. I couldn't go out as much, or if I did, I needed assistance. There were just so many things I couldn't do. I just had a lot of anger building up. And I didn't even realize I was that angry, but I started painting. I don't know, so much as an outlet or a way of defiance in a way. You know, something that is viewed as very visual. After a while, I started becoming less and less angry. The more I painted, the more I could let that out, and to where now it just I have to paint. I started painting was sort of a crazy thing in a way. I mean, I decided I just was going to do it. I couldn't write. I didn't have a computer at the time that could read to me. I feel like if I didn't have some sort of creative outlet, I was going to go crazy. I just needed to put something out there. In a way, it was out of anger. I mean, it was a way of like giving the middle finger to the universe or God or whatever you want to call it. Saying, well, I may not be visual, but I'm still going to do this. So I'm still going to try. And I really didn't care what it looked like. I didn't care if it was visually appealing. I just wanted to do it. I thought the physical action of painting, of putting what's in my mind out there, actually in the physical world, even if no one else liked it, I wanted to create something like that. That's really what got me into it. And I went and got some oil paints and just started. I told my mom that I started painting, and she was like, "Oh, that's great." She was so worried when her and my dad came over one day. She didn't be so supportive, and she didn't want to let me down, but she was so relieved when she looked at it. She liked it. She actually liked it. The reason I lost my vision is I have a seizure disorder. I've had it ever since I was a kid. The seizure will start in the front, and it'll hit the back where the occipital lobe is. Because you actually see back here, the optic nerve travels from your eyes around to the very back. So that my eyes work, I get light in, but the brain, the part that deciphers the image, doesn't know what to make with it. So it's sort of like a TV that you have on, but there's no signal, there's no antenna or cable or anything attached. So it's just it's just snow. It's just from the seizure, which is rare, it turns out. So, but if you have enough of them, you can do it. The main problem when doing a painting, if you can't see it visually, is keeping oriented on the canvas and knowing exactly where you are and what you've done. I'm always drawn using pencils or pens but you can't fill pencils or pen strokes once you put them down. And so I started using Elmer's glue because it dries and it's hard. But Elmer's glue takes about a day to dry. So whenever you make one line, you've got to wait about a day to go back and fill it again. So then I started using the whiteout pen, and that makes a very nice line that you can fill. But if you paint it on canvas, over time it seeps into the canvas, so your drawing will disappear. And now I used this stuff called slick paint, and it dries really, really fast. It doesn't disappear, it stays there, and you can fill it. And it orients you to the painting. And that's really all you need. That's all a person's eyes do whenever they're painting.
Okay, I think I'm going to end it there, and I will post the video so you can watch the rest of it. But I wanted to, kind of introduce you to him a little bit, and then also have him tell you a little bit about how his technique works. But I want to talk more about it. So yes, I interviewed John, and this video was taken a long time ago. He's, this I think is at least 15 years at this point. He's gotten much better. He is now a professional painter. He has a wonderful website, which you can I think it's just johnbramblett.com. And I urge you to look at it. You'll be very impressed. But what I wanted to do is use John's example to start understanding what happens in blind individuals with regard to their sense of touch. So let's go ahead and learn about John a little bit more about his technique, and then we'll talk about how that can teach us general things about what goes on in the brain of the blind with regard to touch. So there's some of John's paintings right there. We'll talk about them in just a second. But John lost his sight. I guess he was officially legally blind by the time he was 25. It was a seizure disorder, as he mentioned. And he it was a very slow process. But by the time he was 25, he really couldn't get around by sight at all. He does have a little light vision, but nothing that allows him to perceive shapes or anything like that. He had no painting experience beyond like what most of us have from elementary school or whenever we last took our art classes. That being said, his mom is, I guess, an amateur painter and has done it all her life. So, it does run in his family, that skill, but he had never tried it before. He considered himself, in terms of his skill, more of a musician, if anything. But he decided to take up painting, kind of, as he said, to kind of, rail against the world and his fate. Like he was so angry, so upset. He thought, I'm going to do something that I'm going to, show, that's going to show the world that I can overcome this handicap that's happened to him. And he's made a livelihood out of it. He's become world famous for it. So let me talk a little bit about his technique, because I think that's going to prove to be really interesting for the kind of the psychology and neuroscience we'll ultimately be talking about. What he does is he uses this thing. I think he called it slick paint, but other names of it are puffy paint. Sometimes it's the type of paint. I don't know if you ever did this when you were a kid, but like if you wanted to make designs on a piece of denim, like the back of a denim jacket or something like that, you use this type of paint to make an outline of something, and it works really, really well on fabric, denim included, and it does leave a raised line. So what he'll do is he'll first, you saw he used a kind of small version of a drawing that he'll do himself using the puffy paint on a piece of paper, and then he'll transfer that onto the big canvas, again using puffy paint to outline the shapes that he'll then fill in with oil paint. So he'll use puffy paint to create the outlines, because it does leave a raised line that he can feel with one hand as he then goes ahead and fills in the paint with the other hand. So you saw him like kind of tracing the lines with his left hand as he was using his right hand to kind of fill in the spaces between the lines to get the kind of main portions of his paints. Now, this is really interesting, and this is one of the most interesting things I thought about. I thought that was actually occurring in his technique, and that is that he uses oil paints. And I don't know if any of you have any experience, just playing with paint as an adult, but if you do, you might know that oil paints are a pain in the butt. They really are. They're very difficult to use. They're messy. They take longer to dry. So most folks use acrylic. They're easier to use. They're less messy. They dry faster. They're more consistent. But the oil paint choice that John has made is for a very, very specific reason. I think you're going to find this really interesting. Oil paints are each composed of different chemicals depending on the color. So a black oil paint will have a very different consistency than a white oil paint. Black oil paint is much more oily and slick. It's thinner. White oil paint, as it turns out, is more like toothpaste. It's thicker. And that's not only true of black and white oil paint, it's also true of all the other colors because they're each made with a different kind of chemical combination. And what that allows him to do is to determine which paint he's working with by using his fingers and feeling, the consistency, the texture, the viscosity of the paints. They're all we call it tactily distinct. That just means they're distinct by touch. He can determine what color he's working with. Now, I should also say, you might have seen them there when he was painting. He also lines up the paints in a specific order, so he knows that the dark colors are to his left, the bright colors are to his right. But just to confirm that he's choosing the paint that he wants to, he'll kind of put some on his brush and then feel a little bit to make sure that yes, he does have red now, yes, he does have blue now. But more than that, if say he wants to create a new color, if he wants to kind of mix colors, which is something you need to do both with oil and acrylic paints, what he will do is he'll take a little dab of one color, a little dab of another color, put it on his easel, I guess the thing that artists hold, and start mixing them around and then feel with his fingers whether or not it feels somewhere in between the textures of the two colors. So say he wants to create a gray. What he'll do is he'll take some white paint, he'll take some black paint, and he'll start mixing them up. And then to know that he's got the type of gray, the kind of brightness of the gray he wants, he'll feel it with his fingers and know that that's in fact going to be the right color for him to, use to convey the image he's trying to convey on the canvas. So it allows him to mix paints through touch. Again, he feels the raised lines with his non-brush hand as he's going along, that's what they showed in the video. And I asked him, has he gotten better at this? I mean, is this something that he's, this was like actually 10 years ago now. I bet he's amazing, but I asked if he's learned any little tricks as he's done more and more painting, and he said, yeah, that video, the one that we just saw, really doesn't capture how quickly, how efficiently he's able to do things now. Rather than feeling the raised lines by touching them with a finger, he can tell where the raised lines are by using the brush to know where they kind of, I guess, are resisting his movements. Actually, these days he can do, yeah, okay, this is also true of the mixtures, so I apologize. I put something different on the slide, but it's this exact same idea that he doesn't need. Let's talk about paint mixing first. These days, because he's had so much practice, he doesn't actually need to touch the paints directly to know what shade they're going to be. He'll put some white and some black on the easel, and then rather than having to touch them, which is messy, he'll just use his brush, and by drawing his brush through the paint, he'll know what shade it is because of the way the paint kind of resists the brush motions. So you can have experienced this, right? If you're pulling a brush through toothpaste versus pulling a brush through oil or some much thinner liquid, you'll know that the resistance to your movements of the brush are going to be different. Well, he's gotten so good, he can do that and tell different shades of mixed color by just not touching it directly, but by feeling the resistance on the brush as he's moving it back and forth across the paints. This is also now how he's able to stay within the lines. You saw, and I write on the slide here, that he needed to feel the raised lines with his finger, but that's not something he really needs to do so much anymore, because he can now feel when there's a raised line there as he's using the brush, he can feel like, oh yeah, the brush is now touching a raised line. So he can basically just touch the painting with his brush and not worry about getting his hands messy, because he has such sensitivity in how the paints, how the raised lines are going to prevent the brush from moving just a little bit, how the brush is resistant on those different lines. That's going to allow him to stay within the lines as he paints. And this is something we're going to be talking about later. It's something I call proxy touch, but it's the idea of just using a tool to make a perceptual judgment about something that we would normally touch. So I think we all do this, like, for example, when we're making soup. If you're making soup and you want to know how thick it is, yes, you can look at it and that will tell you, but it's probably more than that. You can feel the soup's thickness as you mix with a spoon what the resistance on that spoon's movement is. And you know that if there's a lot of resistance on the spoon's movements, it's a thick soup. If you can kind of glide the spoon through the soup more easily, it's a thinner soup. And that's what John Bramlett is doing. The idea that John has gotten so good at it is a really interesting phenomenon that we'll talk about in a second, but it's something that we all do, this proxy touch. We use tools to help us touch and actually can perceive basically through the tool. That's what's meant by proxy touch here. Okay, let me talk a little bit more about John's specific example, and then I'll give you a chance to ask some questions about John. I think a lot of folks find him really, really interesting. So what does John paint? Well, as you can see here, he paints some things through memory. So this is his old church that he used to go to when he was young and still had sight, and he's able to kind of recreate at least his mind's image of that church. And then he also paints things that he experiences now, such as his doggy's face, maybe his friend's face. So he is able to both touch from or paint from memory and also models. And it's the model painting that I think you'll find very interesting. When he paints from models, he'll say, okay, come on over here, Fido. And he'll feel Fido's face. Fido doesn't mind it. He's a doggy. Doggies love being touched all over their faces. And what he'll do is he'll then translate what he's feeling to either a drawing or to his canvas. And then the colors he'll choose, okay, will depend to some degree on how various parts of the skin are feeling to him. So, if the nose feels slippery, he might choose a slippery felt paint. And he realizes that in some cases, the paints he's choosing aren't going to naturally correspond to the real world image. Okay? Instead, they're going to correspond to how parts of the face, parts of a body he's painting feel to him. So it's kind of an interesting kind of way of getting creative and choosing different paints. If this part of a person's face feels slippery, I'll use a more slippery paint. And that's why a lot of his paintings, especially his model painting, where he's actually feeling somebody and doing painting that way, seem kind of almost, I don't know, psychedelic, because the colors seem to kind of be more vibrant and they seem to be, a little bit kind of exaggerated. And that's because the way he's choosing his paint, at least in this case, is based on the feeling. He knows that's a, kind of an artistic move to do that. He's not trying to paint realistically when it comes to that choice. He's trying to paint impressionistically in that he's feeling a face. Ooh, this part feels a little slippery. Let's make it a slicker paint, which might, make the colors more interesting. But what he says is something very interesting, and we'll get back to this later when we discuss how he has become a teacher of painting. And he says that having to experience the world through touch isn't necessarily a hindrance when it comes to being able to represent things in a painting. Because what he believes is that when you touch something, in some ways, you get more detail than just by looking at it. So here, I've got my little glass of water here. And when I hold it up, I can look at it and paint it based on that. Or I could touch it and feel, okay, well, because of the condensation on this glass, I can now kind of represent that differently, and it's coming by virtue of touch. So he thinks, he makes an interesting argument, that having access to objects that he's going to paint by touch might in fact give him more insight of the object's composition. You know, you could imagine that, you know, if you were to paint a chair, you could look at it and paint it, or touch it and paint it. And if you were to touch it, you might get more detail, which I think is a very interesting concept. Let's continue to talk a little bit more about this and some of his other sorts of experiences. This actually is very relevant to what we were discussing. He's taught painting both to blind kids, which is really enjoyable to them. And typically, you know, he'll go to schools of blind children, and their families will be there, and he'll teach painting to both the kids and their families, and they have a blast. And he'll talk about how he's, you know, able to translate what he feels to what he paints. But he also does teach at sighted art schools. So he will go to art schools, colleges where, you know, there's an art class, and talk to them about his experience. And he almost always uses this technique where what he'll do is he'll bring in an apple, and he'll have everybody look at the apple, everybody in this art class look at the apple and paint the apple based on what they see. And, you know, then everyone will look at each other's paintings, and it'll be a very similar looking apple. Yeah, from different angles, of course, but it's an apple. And then what he'll do is he'll have them put that painting away and get a new blank piece of canvas out, and then pass around the apple, have people close their eyes and feel the apple for some extended period of time, say, you know, a minute or up to 5 minutes maybe, and just feel all the detail. And now, after feeling the apple, go ahead and paint it. And they'll open their eyes to do the actual painting. They don't have the skills that John has, of course. But when people do that, the apples that people paint are all very, very different. You know, there's more detail, probably because of the touch, but the kind of interpretations of the apple's shape, the apple's texture, and the apple's color changes based on these sighted artists actually touching their subject, not just seeing their subject. So he makes this really interesting argument that artists might want to consider this, you know, not just looking at what they're going to be painting, but touching what they're going to be painting in order to apprehend more detail and then portray that detail in a painting. When he started to get a little famous, some interesting things happened. One thing is that he was invited by a very wealthy art collector. I don't remember who it was offhand. I think he might have told me, but it was somebody, you know, who was very, very wealthy and very big in the art community. And this person had some famous not famous paintings, but paintings that were by famous people, artists like Van Gogh and Rembrandt and Cézanne. And they invited him over to feel these paintings. And so he would go to their house, and this is not something you can do at a museum, by the way. This has to be something that a person who owns the painting will allow you to do. You can't start poking at paintings at museums. Don't do that. He knows that you can't do that. But he was invited by this owner to go ahead and feel the paintings. And he said it was amazingly enlightening. Because, you know, not only do these paintings look so different, and by the way, for those of you that are interested, there's Van Gogh, there's a Rembrandt, there's a Cézanne. They are very different looking paintings. But now imagine not seeing them, but going up right to the canvas and feeling them. And if you look at the brush strokes that are done by Van Gogh or Rembrandt or Cézanne, you could imagine those brush strokes might be distinct by feel when touching the canvas. And that's exactly what he says. You feel Van Gogh, and you feel those kind of, you know, very small, kind of almost aggressive brush strokes. And they are so different from kind of the more languid brush strokes that Rembrandt used. And those are also so different from kind of the more, I don't know, kind of larger brush strokes that Cézanne used in his paintings. And, you know, he'd ask the art collector to describe the paintings to him as he would draw his hand around the canvases. And, you know, that would be informative to him too, but he was very aware that he was feeling the technique of the artists by actually touching the painting. And so, yeah, you know, you go from one Van Gogh to another, and you can feel what Van Gogh was like when he was painting the picture. And he said, you know, he would imagine that, okay, when Van Gogh was painting this part of the painting, the sky, that they were very, very kind of aggressive brushstrokes. You could imagine that in order for him to do that consistently over a long period of time, that, you know, it probably meant that Van Gogh was in, you know, a certain type of mood, or maybe it helped put him in a certain type of mood. So and the same thing with the Rembrandt and the Cézanne. So he believes that by touching the paintings, not only is he learning something about the techniques, but he's learning something about, you know, the physical state and the emotional state of the artist while they were making the painting, which I think is just so interesting, that by having an experience of touching painting rather than seeing painting, he's in a sense kind of, you know, able to access a recording of the actual painting act that was done during the painting event, you know, hundreds of years ago, which is kind of such a more intimate way of experiencing art. And then he'll tell people about it, you know, he'll write about it, he'll tell art students about this, and it really is an amazing way to think about art being informed by touch. Okay? Let me take a second here before we start talking about the blind and touch, and see if you have any questions about John Bramlett. I know some of you are amateur artists, maybe art majors, and might be really interested in learning more about him. So let me take a second and we'll talk about him. Oops. Great, there's some questions. Okay. Yeah, puffy paint is that little paint that paint that leaves a little raised line that he can then feel or actually experience as resistance to his brush as he's painting in between the lines. That is puffy paint. Jeremy took a quick look at his website and saw that he painted portraits of women. How was he able to know the position of the woman you're in? He had to feel them. Yeah. So what he would do, he paints his wife very often, and he has I think at least one child now, if not two. He'll do lots of portraits, and yes, he will ask them to sit in different positions, and then kind of, you know, feel them, and paint from that. You know, once he gets the kind of puffy paint drawing, whether the puffy paint drawing is on a piece of paper or on his canvas, then he starts filling things in and makes some choices about the colors and all that sort of thing, and that can be a real interesting part of the process as well. Do you think he could feel the technique of artists that weren't professional? Wow, that's a really, really great question. So say I did a painting on canvas. Would he know something about the fact that I was not a professional just by feeling, say, the inconsistencies of what the brushstrokes were like that left the kind of marks on the canvas? And that's a great question. I really want to ask him. I haven't been in touch with him for the last few years, but I'd love to know if he thinks he can tell something about the quality of the art, I guess the experience of the artist as professional or amateur based on the consistency of the brushstrokes or the ease with which the artist was able to put the paint on the canvas. That's a really great question. He can feel what paints make up. Not exactly sure what you're asking there, Zena. He can feel what paints make up. Yeah, I mean, if you're asking whether or not he can feel the paint's consistencies, absolutely, that is something he can do. Okay, he can feel what paints make up a paint mixture. Yes, so exactly, that's the question. I understand now. So yes, originally he could touch the paint and know what color he was. Oh, are you asking, Zena, about whether he could tell the color of the paint that other artists did? Like, can he tell when he feels a Van Gogh that this is yellow, this is reddish, that sort of thing? Yes, he can to some degree, but I should be clear on this, that Van Gogh used oil paints, okay, not acrylic. He used oil. I don't think they had acrylic back then. But when oil paints dry, they do have still some different consistencies, but the consistencies are not as distinct after they dry. So in other words, he's not able to tell the color as well as he is for his own paintings when he's applying the paint, which are still wet? That's a very good question. Aida says, I think in the book he mentioned that tracing the line is like walking on a street. What's the difference between this? Oh, okay. Aida, you're asking a question about the tongue display unit, which we're going to be talking about, if not later today, certainly on Tuesday. And so let's answer that question there. That's a very good question. Any other questions about John Bramblett before we get into some of the science of touch and the blind? Anything? Okay, great. So let's start talking about that. All right. And this, you know, I have to just kind of give a little bit of a tiny bit of a warning here. This stuff will get a little more technical than some of the things that have been in previous classes, but I promise, conceptually, it really isn't difficult at all. But we're going to start talking about brain imaging techniques and things like that. And I'm not worried about you understanding the technical details as much as the concepts. Okay, as much as the ideas that are being conveyed by this research. So let's talk a little bit about this. And this is research having to do with blindness and touch. So you're looking at these images and going, oh no, it's going to be one of those sort of talks where we're going to learn about the brain and all these brain parts. And I'm not one of those brain part guys. I mean, I have brain parts, but I'm not that worried about you memorizing the technical name for a brain area. We're going to be talking about, parts of the brain that typically are more devoted to vision versus touch and stuff like that. That's really all I want you to know. I want you to know the concepts. I want you to know the cool stuff, because you probably forget the names of the different names of the brain areas, the technical names, by summer, unless you're going to go into that field, which you'll learn in other classes anyway. So, what's it like to be blind when it comes to your touch system? It is, in fact, the case that blind individuals, especially if they're born blind, do have greater touch sensitivity. So I don't know if you're aware of this, but as you get older, your sense of touch does degrade a little bit. You become less sensitive in touching things. So, I don't have the sensitivity I did when I was your age when it comes to touching textures and things like that. You might know something about this is considered to be possibly one of the reasons that older folks are more prone to falling. There's possibly a number of reasons for this, but one of them is that in order to stand upright, in order to be successful at walking around, we use the bottom of our feet to feel the ground, okay? That sensitivity, especially into older age, decreases. And we know this for a fact, that an older person is less sensitive on the bottom of their feet than a younger person like you. And so that's considered to be one of the reasons that older people sometimes fall, is that they don't have as good a sense of the feel of the ground as a younger person does. So that's something, sadly, that's going to happen to all of us. But not all of us fall. We can compensate for that to some degree. When one is blind, they are able to kind of improve their sense of touch as if they're rolling the clock back 25 years. Okay, so somebody who is sighted at the age of, say, 60 will start to feel the ground a little less and have less of a sense of touch. But somebody who is blind will be 25 years, healthier in their sense of touch. It's like rolling them back. It's like they have the touch skills of a typical 35-year-old. So they can roll back the clock 25 years by heightening their sense of touch by virtue of their blindness. So why is that the case? That's a big difference, actually. That is a big difference. So, they can feel the ground much better when they get older. Of course, for a blind individual, falls is a real issue, but it's not because they can't feel the ground well. It has to do with other things. So it's a big difference. And why is that the case? Well, you might think, well, one reason is that the blind have more experience touching, and that's certainly true. And one of the maybe the most important things that they do touch is Braille. So I assume most of us know what Braille is. Those are the raised dots that the Braille used to read. Usually when I'm teaching this in a class, I will show that pretty much every sign on campus has a Braille message on the bottom, which is conveying the same information. So, you know, if I was doing this in a lecture hall, I go to the wall and show you there's a sign there that either gives the number of the room or it says exit or something like that. And that sign underneath will have little raised dots, and that's for the visually impaired to be able to tell what that sign says. Okay. So you might think, well, that's why the blind are better with touch. But let me tell you something about Braille, and a lot of people aren't aware of this unless they've done some research on the blind, if they maybe have somebody in their family that's blind. Is actually very few blind individuals actually use Braille. Braille takes some time to learn. It is not something that's very easy, and it's about 10% that use it. Certainly, if somebody's planning on going to college, certainly in the old days they would have to learn Braille. Okay. However, I think these numbers have actually gone down. I think less than 10% of the blind use it now because they're able to access so easily any written material, any text material through having their computer read it to them. I mean, that hasn't been around forever. Our computers weren't always able to read to us. We didn't have audiobooks. We didn't have podcasts, all that sort of stuff where it's a book on, recorded. So that's a relatively new phenomenon. So less people are actually, I think, using Braille than, say, even 10, 15 years ago. So it's a very small percentage. I think the last I looked, it was like 8% or something like that of blind individuals actually use Braille. And it certainly is the case that individuals who don't use Braille have this heightened touch sensitivity as well. It's not just the Braille. So that's not it. What is it? And here's I think one of the most interesting concepts in the book. It has to do with how the senses compensate for each other. And this is a topic that's really interesting to me. It's a topic that we kind of examine in my laboratory's research to some degree. It's called cross-modal plasticity. And it just has to do with the idea that when one sense is deprived, the other senses kind of help compensate for that deprivation. That's all it means. When one sense is deprived, like vision, the other senses help out. Okay. Now, the degree to which they can help out depends on a lot of things. And, we're not talking about, what's the guy's name? Daredevil here, right? I don't know if you've ever seen the movie or the TV show Daredevil. This is the guy who's blind but has learned to heighten his senses so well that he doesn't really need vision. He can, fight the bad guys just using sound and touch and all that sort of thing. We are not talking about that's a comic book. That's fantasy. That's not something that's an extreme version of what's going on. That's not reality. But the plasticity does occur, and there is this compensation. And it's the fact that there's any compensation at all that is really interesting to scientists, and the kind of neuroscience that goes into that has been really interesting to folks. So what I'm going to do is talk about a little bit of this brain science about plasticity that occurs with blindness, to give you an idea of how it's studied and why it's studied. It's going to seem a little technical at first, but I'm going to walk you through it. We'll get through it together, I think. I'm not a technical guy myself. If I can understand it, you can understand it. Trust me. So what happens when we touch things? When we touch things, what we're doing is we are activating a part of our brain called, well, I'm not going to even tell you what it's called, but it's this part of the brain right here. Right there. There's a little kind of strip here. I can show you what it looks like on this image here. There's a little strip of our brain right here that is activated, and it's thought to be used to decipher things when we touch them. So here I am touching this little object here, and what I'm doing is I'm lighting up a little strip of my brain over there. It's called the somatosensory cortex, and I didn't even put that on the slide because I don't want you to have to remember. I just call it the touch brain region. By the way, if you're interested, and we will be interested later on, this is what it looks like from the side of your brain. And then if you were to kind of turn the brain around and look at it from the back and kind of just cut that piece out, what you would see is something kind of cool. It's a little map of different parts of our bodies on the on this little strip. So let me see if I can read this here. That's hard to read there. But our toes are represented in this part, and our legs are represented in this part, and our tongue's represented that part. And then, look at this guy. This is the sort of image you often see when people are discussing this part of the brain. I love these images. I think they're hysterical. Why do we have that type of image when discussing the brain? What that is doing is showing how different parts of the body are represented on this part of the brain. And it's showing how much area of the brain is devoted to which body part. So as you can see, the hands are really big, the tongue and the mouth are really big, our ears are really big. And what all that means here in this image is that there's a disproportionately large amount of this brain area dedicated to that body region. So maybe unsurprisingly, there's a large part of that little strip on our brain that's dedicated to our hands, which means that our hands are really sensitive to touch. And that's also true of the mouth. Our mouth is very sensitive to touch. What else? Our lips, our ears, for some reason. But all these different kind of exaggerations of the body part is just indicating that that touch part of the brain dedicates itself, dedicates areas based on how important that is for touching, how important that body part is for touching. Touching with our hand is very important. Having a large area of our brain dedicated to our hand touch allows our hands to be more sensitive. So when we touch things, sighted people touch things, that's what we activate. When a blind person touches things, they do activate that part, but they also activate visual areas, parts that are usually dedicated to visual perception, to touch. Okay, this is kind of the important shift here. That John Bramblett and Daniel Kish touch something. Yes, the same thing happens with them that happens with me, that little strip gets lit up. But what doesn't really happen with me, and does happen with blind individuals, is that the visual areas of their brain, the parts of the brain that are usually dedicated to vision for most of us, for them, get reassigned to touch. So they do a little activity of touching here. Their visual brain areas, visual cortex, light up more than ours. Okay. So here's the idea that their visual brain isn't getting any input because they're blind. They're saying, okay, imagine you're the little guy living in the brain, and you say, hey, I'm not getting any information. Can I help out the other senses here? Hearing, touch, do you guys need help? And they go, sure, yeah, go ahead. So the visual brain then says, okay, I'm going to reassign myself to touch. I'm going to reassign myself to hearing and make that sense more sensitive. And that's exactly what goes on. Okay. So how do we know about this? We know about this through a lot of different things. First of all, originally we knew about it through work with individuals who are blind for most of their lives and then have had strokes. So for example, I can't remember when this was initially reported, maybe in the 60s or 70s, there'd be a blind person who was blind from birth and was a great Braille reader, and then sadly when they were in their 70s had a stroke that affected their visual brain areas. Okay. As it turns out, at that point, you'd think that, well, it wouldn't have any effect on their vision, they're blind anyway, shouldn't really have much of an effect on anything at all. But it did have an effect. It had an effect on their skills with touch. Not all their skills with touch, by the way. They were still able to feel objects and say, oh, sure, I feel a glass. I feel a deck of cards. But what they weren't able to do anymore was to use Braille. And that at first seemed very counterintuitive. Why would their skills at touching Braille be affected by a stroke, a brain lesion in their visual area? And this what kind of started the ball rolling on realizing that the visual brain area gets reassigned to touch for individuals who've lost a sense. Fortunately, we don't need to rely on people who've had brain lesions anymore to teach us these things, because we are in an age where we can induce brain lesions. Now that sounds terrible. I know what you're thinking, inducing brain lesions. What's that going to do to people? But the good news is we can do this very gently and very transiently. In other words, it means that we can induce a very temporary, very subtle disruption to the brain to see how the brain affects behavior. Okay, very cool. It's called transcranial magnetic stimulation. Transcranial magnetic stimulation, and you know, I know that's a kind of technical sounding term, but let me just tell you what it is. This is it right here. By the way, I've been a subject in these experiments. It's not painful. It's not upsetting or anything like that. Basically, something's just put on the outside of the head, and in this case, it's put on the outside of the visual areas, which are in the back of the brain. And a pulse of energy is sent to that part of the brain. And while that is occurring, okay, it basically doesn't quite shut off that part of the brain, but it disrupts it. And so this is a really interesting way that we can now kind of induce a temporary lesion, a temporary kind of shutting down or at least disruption of that part of the brain to see how that part of the brain is involved in perceptual skill and motor skill and all that sort of stuff. For us folks interested in the brain, for us folks interested in how behavior in the brain work together, this is a really, really interesting thing. You know, something, you know, I'm just going to very quickly do this because I feel like you guys haven't had a chance to play around as much as we would have liked. I'm going to finish this lecture as a roll of toilet paper. Okay, so let's continue with this discussion. And very quickly go back to here. Wait from here. Okay, this is really important stuff, so we got to keep talking about this. Oh, hold on a second. Okay, I don't want to take too much time here, but share screen. There we go. Okay, there I am, the toilet paper. I know we're all missing it. Look at that, that's a lonely little roll of toilet paper. Oh my gosh. But let's go back to this. Sorry about that. I just wanted to be something. Okay, so this is transcranial magnetic stimulation, and it induces a very temporary lesion. God, I am a smart-looking piece of toilet or a roll of toilet paper. So this is what happens when you use this tool and affect the touch areas, that little strip on the side here. So you kind of swing around that little, what we call these little mouse ear kind of looking things, and now position it so it's right outside the touch region. Okay, what that does for subjects is it, regardless of whether they're blind or sighted, it disrupts our ability to perceive shapes by touch. Okay, so now whether you're doing this to me or doing this to John Bramblett, it becomes very difficult for me to say, oh yeah, this is a box that's you know, kind of you know, has this sort of dimensions and that sort of thing. It's not completely disruptive. I should mention it's something that's going to absolutely make it impossible to recognize things through touch, but it's going to make it much more difficult. So there's a loss of shape discrimination through touch when you impart this transient lesion to that part of the brain. Okay. However, if you then swing it back, the little mouse ears, back to the back part of the brain right here and turn it on, okay, you're not going to lose the ability to discriminate shapes from touch. Okay, what you're going to do, if an individual is blind, is it's going to affect their ability to discriminate fine sorts of dimensions of touch. So they will in fact lose their ability, if they are Braille readers, and certainly Daniel Kish is, and I think John is too, if you're breaking temporarily that part of the brain, they will lose that ability. When you do this for sighted folks, okay, so you just basically, kind of give a little pulse to the visual brain area for me and you, okay, it doesn't affect our sense of touch. It affects our sense of vision a little bit, but it doesn't affect our sense of touch at all, okay? However, when you do this to John Bramblett, when you do this to Daniel Kish, other individuals who are blind, it affects their sense of touch directly. And it affects it in a different way. It affects it in a way that seems to influence their finer kind of discrimination of touch. So now they might be able to tell you this is a box that I'm feeling versus a sphere that I'm feeling, but they might not be able to tell you if there's braille on the box or braille on that. And so what it suggests is that for these individuals, yes, the visual brain that's not getting any visual input is there to help touch. But it's not there to help touch in every way. It's there to help touch when it comes to fine grained touch, being able to touch small things and being able to discriminate small things by touch, which is really interesting. It's not like, the visual brain just says, I'm going to help with all aspects of touch. The visual brain's going to say, I'm going to help with aspects of touch that are, kind of more refined. I'm going to let the rest of the touch area of the brain do what it normally does. I'm going to help you kind of improve your fine kind of touch skills. So, you might be able to use braille better. You might be able to, determine textures of things a little bit better. It's not just a general sort of improvement, a general sort of a compensation. It's a compensation that is targeted to very specific types of skills. Okay. And yeah, I think that's a good place to end today. It's a lot going on today, given the Chancellor was there and all that stuff. So why don't we stop there, and we'll continue this discussion on Tuesday. Again, I'll post all the grades, the numbers, along with the letter scale tomorrow. So probably sometime midday tomorrow at the latest. Okay. All right. See you next time.